Good morning, Rabbi Zeph.
Hi there. Good morning.
Hi.
Okay. Bruce, you were able to send out the. Okay. So today we're going to take a look at something just serendipitous. I was on Shabbat. I was asked to prepare Dvar Torah for the graduates of Yeshivat Har Zion video. I started looking at this week's parsha coming up, and I just stumbled upon something extremely interesting. And so on Shabbat, I was spending a lot of time. I was crippled. I couldn't use the computer, but I think someone should invent a computer program. Somebody you can use it on Shabbat, your computer, because without the computer, unless you're Rav Kanievsky, whose funeral's today, if you don't know everything by heart, it can be a problem. Okay, so we have at least one Kohen here. Any other Kohanim? Okay, this is actually of great relevance to everybody. So let me just do a screen share here. And let's see here. Okay, so does everybody see this?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So in this week's Parsha, right, coming up, Shmini, it's the conclusion of the very dramatic inauguration of the Mishkan and of the Kohanim. And the episode ends on a high note and then followed by a tragedy. So that high note is expressed in the following pasuk: Vayisa Aaron et yadav el ha'am va'avarachem. That Aaron lifted up his hands to the people and he blessed them. That's all we have to see in that pasuk. So that's this high point of the priestly blessing. There's actually dispute whether this is describing the Bרכת כהנים that we say today. So Rashi and most commentators say when it says that Aaron lifted up his hands, he blessed the people. So that he actually used the Bרכת כהנים as we are familiar with it. The only problem with that, of course, is that Bרכת כהנים actually only appears much later on in the Torah. So then you have to assume this idea of Ein Muktam Muchar b'Torah. The Torah is not written chronologically, etc. So I don't want to get involved in that issue. Ramban happens to think that it's not the classical Bרכת כהנים, which was the content of Aaron's bracha, but that's for another time. Bruce would be delighted to give you a shiur on that particular topic. What really struck me is a comment of Rabbeinu Bachaye or Rabbeinu Bachya. It's the same person. There are two Rabbeinu Bachyas. Don't be confused. So there's an important work, Chovot HaLevavot, the duties of the heart, which was written by Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda, very early medieval rabbi. And then there's Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, who's a little bit later, Spain, who wrote a commentary on the Torah, which I happen to be particularly fond of. So let's take a look at what he has to say here. Now, part of the interesting thing about this text of Rabbeinu Bachya is that the text has gone through multiple phases of censorship. And as a result, it's a little bit hard to figure out what he's talking about. And if you take a look at the different editions of Rabbeinu Bachya or Bachaye, in this particular comment, you'll see a different text. There's at least 3 different versions. Yes.
Is this the first time in the Torah that we're going to see a blessing that's not a deathbed blessing? Because there are blessings before, but they always seem to be sort of on the deathbed, like Yaakov to his children. And so is this the first case of a stam blessing? I mean,
So I'm afraid to answer that. It's a good question, and I'm not sure exactly. It may be, but I wouldn't want to give a definitive answer without my computer. So, I sometimes refer to my wife as my external hard drive. She remembers things better than me. So it's not my wife, but my computer. By the way, I love them both very dearly. Now I'm going to try to give you a sense of the different versions that went through censorship. So I tried to duplicate this in the English translation. It happens to be that the website Al HaTorah has an English translation, which I had to change. It had a lot of, I think, mistakes in it. So let me try to give you a sense of the problematics of the text of Rabbeinu Bachya. So he says the following, right? The Torah says, "Vayisaron et yadav el ha'am vayivarchem," that Aaron lifted up his hands, el ha'am. I'm not going to translate that. Vayivarchem, and he blessed them. So Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher says the meaning of the words el ha'am is for the sake of the people and for their benefit. That's what el means, for the sake of, for their benefit. Now, just to see if anybody here is awake, if I were to ask you to translate that, Vayisaron et yadav, that Aaron lift up his hands, el ha'am, how would you translate it? Anybody to make a suggestion?
To the nation.
The people.
Yeah, to the people. Or towards, something like that, right? It's actually directional, right? You lifted up his hands, el. Like if I say I'm going to Jerusalem, right? El Yerushalayim, right? So Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, for some reason, he says it doesn't mean that. It means on behalf of. Okay, right? For the sake of, on behalf of. Now, here's the problem. If you look in some versions of Rabbeinu Bachya, it skips where he says, and for their benefit, and then immediately it skips down to that Aharon lifted his hand. Everybody see that? So there's a parenthetical statement, then a statement in brackets, and then that Aaron lifted his hand. So that is the most common version of Rabbeinu Bachya that circulated until recently. So I just want to give you a sense of how problematic it is and how you can't even read it in a way that makes sense. Let's just read it as if the parenthetical sentence and the bracketed sentence don't exist, which is the way it's actually printed in the earlier editions. The meaning of the words el ha'am is for the sake of the people and for their benefit, that Aaron lifted his hand in order to wave to and fro towards them, as they do with the right hand. Now, did anybody notice how that's an impossible reading? Right? El ha'am, according to Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, means for the sake of, not directional. And then he immediately, if you erase, there are those who say, and our opponents, and just write that Aaron lifted his hand in order to wave to and fro towards them, that's the exact opposite of what he just said. And believe it or not, that's the way earlier editions of Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher that were printed read. Is a total non sequitur. He's saying it doesn't mean towards, it means for the benefit of. And then he says that Aaron lifted his hands in order to wave to and fro towards them, which is an opinion he just rejected. Now, here's the great secret. We have other printed editions of Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher that had a phrase put in as kind of connective tissue to at least make more sense, which is the parenthetical statement. So let's read it that way. The meaning of the words el ha'am is for the sake of the people and for their benefit. There are those who say concerning this verse that Aaron lifted his hand in order to wave to and fro towards them. So that's a very common, in the Bar Ilan database, that's why he's printed. So it sounds, according to this, at least it solves the problem that the sentence that Aaron lifted his hand in order to wave to and fro towards them contradicts what he just said. It solves the problem by saying there are those who say. right? It's a different view. So I solved that problem of an internal contradiction of Rabbeinu Bachya. The only problem is that according to this version, it's a legitimate view. Some famous Jewish commentator said, oh, it doesn't mean for the sake of, but rather it means towards. The hands are facing the congregation.
Well, could you say that if the people are all over the place, that it's very hard to make a directional anything with millions of people? You know, it's not like going to a location. Very specific. This is too general.
So are you trying to explain why Rabbeinu Bachya says it doesn't really mean towards?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You'll understand in a minute why. I'm glad you're thinking along those lines right now. You're jumping the gun just a bit, but you're going to see that's going to be the whole point of the discussion, is to show why he said what he said. But I want to just build up the suspense here for a second. So this makes it sound like it's a machloket. Now, by the way, guess what? It does happen to be a machloket among the medieval commentators. And I just want to show you how our good friend, the Ibn Ezra, actually says the view that's Rabbeinu Bachya is rejecting, right? This is the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says, Aaron lifted up his hands towards the people, toward the people, right? So there is such a view among Jewish commentators, but I'm going to show you that that's not what Rabbeinu Bachya was rejecting. So now let's go up. I'm going to show you the manuscript of Rabbeinu Bachya. What he really said, okay? What he really said is the meaning of the words Elam is for the sake of the people and for their benefit. Now, this phrase, parenthetical phrase, there are those who say concerning this verse, that's fake. That was taken out. That was put in there by the censors, or actually by Jews, because of the censors. It doesn't belong there. It's not part of the original manuscript. The original manuscript then begins with the brackets. Okay, so we're going to read it now the right way. The meaning of the words Elam is for the sake of the people, for their benefit. Our opponents who dress themselves up in a hairy mantle in order to deceive are wrong when they say that the meaning of these words is that Aaron lifted his hand in order to wave to and fro towards them as they do with the right hand. Okay, that's the real words. These are the real words of Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher. But what is this? Our opponents who dress themselves up in a hairy mantle in order to deceive? So the English translation is slightly awkward, but in Hebrew especially, this is very strong language that he is discussing an alternative interpretation of the Torah, which is offered by people who are pretending to be pious. This hairy mantle is an expression from the prophets. It actually is interesting. It sounds a little bit like who dressed up in a hairy outfit in order to deceive? Yaakov, right? Yaakov. When he put the fur on his arms, right, to pretend to be Esau. So, in any case, the Rebbe Bach says that there are these horrible people. Balei Rivenu is the Hebrew for our opponents, who are liars, deceivers, bluffers, con artists, who pretend that they're pious. And they say that it means Aaron lifted his hand in order to wave to and fro towards them, as they do with the right hand. And they bring proof from a midrash that the word Yadav in the Torah, his hands, is actually spelled Yud Daled Vav. Is spelled without the letter Yud. Yadav is usually spelled Yud Daled Yud Vav, but it's actually spelled in the Torah Yud Daled Vav. Spelled without the letter Yud, indicating it's really a singular. If you just read it without any vowels, you would read it Yado, his hand. Okay, now let me just clarify what's going on here. Rabbeinu Bachya says it means he lifted up his hands upwards, not towards the people. And it was hands, not hand. And it was up, not towards the people. Now, these horrible opponents who are bluffers and liars, they say it doesn't mean hands, it means hand. And more than that, it wasn't lifted straight up. Aaron, in fact, pointed towards the people, waving with hand, Yud Dalet Vav. That's actually what it says in the Torah, though it's not pronounced that way. Pronounced Yadav, his hands. But Yado, his hand, waving towards the crowd. Okay. Now, let's read on just a little bit more. And then we're going to, first of all, figure out to whom is he referring in such strong language. You'll see that it gets even stronger. Our answer to them to seal shut their lying mouths is that traditionally we read the word as if it had been spelled with the letter Yud, Yadav, plural, his hands. That is that Aaron raised both his hands. Their argument that Aaron only raised his right hand, as if it said Yado, his hand, Yud Dalet Vav, his right hand in motion, waving, is null and void. Okay, now I want to show you something. You'll excuse me if we're going to read from the King James Bible for a second here. This is the King James Version till this very day. And Aaron lifted up his hand toward the people and blessed them. So, right, that's a incorrect translation according to Rabbeinu Bachya, because it really says Aaron lifted up his hands. That's how we pronounce it, right? Often there's a distinction between the word, the way it's printed, and how we have a tradition how to pronounce it. It's actually written Yud Dalet Vav as if it said his hand, but our tradition is to pronounce it Yadav, his hands. And when it says Elam, it doesn't mean toward the people. It means, according to Rabbeinu Bachya, on their behalf. But you see that there's a double mistake, according to the King James Version. Aaron lifted up his hand, one hand, and toward the people as if he's waving to them, like this. Now, we know Rabbeinu Bachya, based upon this, is referring to the Christian interpretation of the verse. Now, why so much heat, and why did he speak so strongly against this Christian interpretation of that verse? We'll get there eventually. But I just want to develop this a bit, what he's rejecting. Now think for a second about how the Christians understood that verse. Aaron, a Kohen, the high priest, the head of this religion, and he's waving towards the people with one hand, Yado, his right hand, something in his right hand. Well, guess who does that? You ever seen the Pope Mobile? This is the Pope Mobile. Now, they didn't have a Pope Mobile, at least wasn't the motor like nowadays, of course, but they had a Pope Mobile. And the Pope, the head of the church, would come out in front of the crowds of people like Bruce, like you were describing, and he waves his hand, blessing the people. He's Aaron a Kohen. He's Aaron the high priest. And the church is claiming that the Pope is sort of the inheritor of the mantle, not the hairy mantle, as Rabbeinu Bachya said. He's the inheritor of the mantle of Aaron. He's the head of the church. And Aaron waved to the crowd with his right hand. And that's why the Pope waves to the crowd with his right hand. The assumption being that the Pope is not just some guy. He is invested with spiritual power. and that spiritual power emanates from his hand as he waves his right hand over the crowds of faithful Christians. Rabbeinu Bachya says that this notion that the Pope is somehow the incarnation of Aaron, the high priest, and that the behavior of the Pope is based upon what we know about Aaron, that Aaron had this power to bless the people with his right hand as these supernatural blessing waves shoot forth from his fingertips, blessing the multitudes of Christians. Rabbeinu Bachya is extremely upset about this interpretation, and therefore says, the Torah doesn't even say his hand, it says Yadav. That's the right way to pronounce it, even though it says Yud Aleph Vav. And El Ha'am doesn't mean towards the people, it means for their benefit, on their behalf. Okay. Now, the Rabbeinu Bachya does have to deal with the problem that the Torah does say Yud Daled Vav, his hand, except that's not the way we pronounce it, right? It's a Kri and Ketiv. That we have many examples of how the word is written versus how it's pronounced. This is an example of that. But why is it printed Yud Daled Vav? Because that is true. It's printed Yud Daled Vav, or written Yud Daled Vav, right? His hand. So, and the Christians even cited a midrash. They claim that it says Yud Daled Vav, which means his hand, right? They brought their proof from our own tradition. So let's see what Rabbeinu Bachya says about that. He says, and with regards to our sages pointing out that the written text is in the singular, his hand, Yado, Yud Daled Vav, is to indicate the right hand is more important than the left hand. Whenever we talk about a hand, there's always this assumption that the hand by default is the right hand. It's the more powerful hand, with all due respect to lefties out there. It's this more powerful hand. That the right hand is more important than the left hand concerning mystical matters. It's Kabbalistic, he says. The reason it's written Yud Daled Vav is a Kabbalistic allusion to the superiority of the right. And these mystical matters are revealed only to select individuals. That is why the Kabbalists have said that the word is spelled Yud Daled Vav, even though we don't pronounce it that way, in the singular. And in this way, justice is done both to the spelling and the traditional reading. In other words, we read it. I think someone's microphone is on and I can hear his wife or whatever. Okay, so it's written Yud Daled Vav to tell you that there's a superior to the right hand, but it's pronounced Yadav because, practically speaking, that's what we do. The Kohanim use both hands, okay? And it's not towards the people, but straight up. Okay, now, he goes on and shows you some interesting proofs, but I just want to show you that this notion that it's written Yud Daled Vav for mystical Kabbalistic reasons to allude to the fact that there's something significant about hand, meaning right, that actually is codified. I want to show you something. So we're going to take a look at the Zohar. The Zohar says, a Kohen must set up the right hand over the left. As it is said, Aaron lifted up his hand. The Torah text says his hand, not his hands, right? This is exactly the midrash which the Catholics were citing, the Zohar, right? Except for, Rabbeinu Bachya explains, this is not really telling you that Aaron lifted up just one hand to wave it like the Pope, right? But rather, it's a mystical idea which is expressed by having the right hand slightly higher than the left. Right? Both hands, but right should be higher than the left for mystical reasons. And this is also codified in one of the major commentaries on the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. So it's called Hagot Maimoniot, Rabbi Meir Cohen, 13th century Germany, who, based upon this Zohar apparently, codifies here. It is written his hand, Yado, even though it's pronounced Yadav, his hands. From here we learn the Kohen must lift up his right hand a bit higher than the left, and based upon these Kabbalistic considerations. So it's interesting that this approach of hand versus hands that the Catholics adopt is in fact incorporated in a kind of symbolic way. The right hand is higher than the left, and that's expressed through these Kabbalistic works, the Zohar, the Hagot Maimoniot, who brings it down, and it's actually in Shulchan Aruch. I don't think I showed you that. Here, let's just take a look in case our resident Kohen here is not sure. It says in Shulchan Aruch, they lift up their hands parallel to their shoulders and raise the right hand a bit above the left. So this mystical interpretation of the fact that it's printed Yud Daled Vav, his hand, and the way Rabbeinu Bachya interprets it, Zohar and Hagot Maimoniot, right? That there is something to do with one hand. It's that one hand is higher than the other. Not that the whole blessing is through one hand. It has nothing to do with waving and emitting somehow these blessings from the hand of the Pope in his Pope mobile. Okay, fine. Now I want to take a look at the rest of the discussion of Rabbeinu Bachya as he tries to argue his case. He says the following. When you compare the prayer Moses uttered when he prayed for the victory of the Israelites against the attack by Amalek in Exodus chapter 17, verse 11, you'll also find this dual spelling of the word Yud Daled Vav, his hand. Now, he's going to show you how the fact that Yud Daled Vav is written in the Torah, but we pronounce it Yadav, his hands, there's an ample precedent for that. It's not the only place in the Torah where a reference to hands is written by just saying Yud Daled Vav, which technically, if you pronounced it like it's written, it would be hand, not hands. So what does the Torah say? That, right, Moshe lifted up his hands, right, in this battle against Amalek. And there it's written, V'haya kasher yirim Moshe yado v'gavar Yisrael. When Moshe lifted up his yado, it's spelled yado, Yud Daled Vav. That's how you'd pronounce it if you didn't have any vowels, except for in the same passage, it says explicitly in the continuation of the story, in the following two verses, the word is spelled as Yadav in the normal way. So within the same few verses, Yud Daled Vav, his hand, and then it says Yud Daled Yud Vav, his hands. So you see the Torah uses these spellings interchangeably, and the determinative factor is the tradition, right? Even though it says Yud Daled Vav, we pronounce it Yadav, as say Yud Daled Yud Vav. Fine. Had Moses used only one hand at a time, it is hard to understand why he needed two men to support his hands, as it is evident from the psukim, right? Aaron and Hur were supporting his hands. It wasn't hand. You need two people to hold one hand. And so Yud Daled Vav and Yud Daled Yud Vav are interchangeable, and they both are pronounced Yadav, and they both mean hands, plural. If our opponents who understood, remember, Catholics, if our opponents who understood our verses aren't waving his hand towards the people, remember, that's the Pope, embodying Aaron's blessing to the people. Instead of raising his hands towards God, it would be correct. The Torah should have written instead, Vayisa Aharon et Yadav el Ha'am. The formula, Vayishlach Aharon et Yadav el Ha'am. Now he deals with the issue of directionality. Were the hands towards the people, waving like this, or straight up? So he says, if in fact it meant towards, there's another way in Hebrew of saying that. You don't say Vayisa Aharon. Vayisa Aharon literally means lifted up his hands. It would have said Vayishlach. He sent his hands. Where does he get that from? Not making it up. It is the custom for a father who prepares to bless his son to put his hand on his head, just as Yaakov did when he prepared to bless the two sons of Joseph. In that instance, the Torah wrote, Vayishlach Yisrael et Yamino, that Israel, Vayishlach, that's the verb used. He extended his right hand to confer the blessing, right? So we see, according to Rabbeinu Bachya, if it was to extend towards, the verb is Vayishlach. The verb Vayisa doesn't mean that. That means to lift up towards heaven, as he goes on to explain. In our verse, the Torah employs the verb Vayisa to show that Aaron's hands were stretched upwards towards heaven. We have a parallel example in the book of Kings, right? And what does it say there? It says it was when King Solomon had completed this entire prayer and entreaty with his palms outstretched heavenwards, right? So there, Shlomo is giving a blessing. And what does it say there? The kapav pusot hashamayim. His hands were extended towards heaven. See, there's explicit. This blessing, and look at the parallelism, by the way. This is at the conclusion of the inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash. Just like in our case, the conclusion of the inauguration of the Mishkan. And there, Shlomo is blessing the people, just like Aaron blessed the people. And it says explicitly, towards heaven, not towards the people. He is not the Pope. So the Pope is neither Aaron, a Kohen, and he's not Shlomo HaMelech either. He's just a faker. So says Rabbeinu Bachya. Fine. Now, I think it's interesting to note that how engaged Rabbeinu Bachya was in this, how, or maybe I should say enraged. Somehow this got his goat, this issue. So much so they used this very strong language that had to be censored multiple times to try to make it a little bit less violent towards Christians. I want to try to understand our last few minutes here why he was so upset about this. So this is a little bit speculative, what I'm about to say. I want to take a look at a famous passage in a Mishnah. It's in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. The Mishnah says the following. We're going to go back to this other example of hands being raised and a certain power associated with that. It's very famous. And it came to pass when Moshe held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. By the way, I should say hands. I have to speak to Rabbeinu Bachya about this. In any case, the Mishnah now says, it may be asked, did the hands of Moshe make war when he raised them, or break war when he lowered them? Rather, the verse comes to tell you that as long as the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed. But if not, they fell. This is an extremely important passage here. You're going to see how this has tremendous repercussions. It's one of my pet peeves, and we'll get to that towards the end. Moshe is lifting up his hands. He's conducting the war. Sounds like it. It's magic. When his hands are up, Jews prevail. Hands are down, Amalek prevails. What's going on there? The Mishnah takes it, just hang on a second, Bruce. The Mishnah takes it for granted that the hands aren't doing anything. No magic. It's symbolic. Moshe is saying, look up to heaven. Our salvation is from God, not my hands. When Moshe's hands are down and people aren't looking up to heaven and they think that they have to rely upon their own resources, they're defeated. Now the Mishnah goes on. A very similar type of passage. Similarly, you can say the verse states, make for yourself a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. So there's this very strange passage of this punishment to the Jewish people. And there's a copper snake that Aaron has on top of a big pole, and he holds it up. And that saves the Jewish people. This sounds like magic to me. And the Mishnah says, no, don't misinterpret this. Once again, it may be asked, did this copper servant kill? Or did this copper servant preserve life, this copper servant on the top of this pole? No. It's on this high pole, just like the hands, high up, looking towards heaven. When the Jewish people turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed. But if not, they were rotted from their snake bites. So this notion of looking upwards, the hands of Moshe directed upwards, this copper serpent on the big pole, no magic. It's in order to realize that we only have one source. Nobody's hands, no magic, no voodoo. Our Father in heaven, the source of our salvation. Yes, Bruce.
So I wonder, when we have phrases like "don't set an eye on him," or "don't lift a hand against him," or even in Joshua when it says he took the shoe off his foot, that all these phrases in the singular are simply generically a generic term. But in the context of the story, we saw that Moshe's hands were being held by two different people, Hor and Yeshua, not Yeshua, Hor and
Aaron and Hor.
Yeah, and therefore, in the context of the story, we can see whether it's singular or plural. But somehow, when the singular is used, it's just a generic term, as I'm pointing out.
Okay, so you're trying to explain why is it that we have this strange phenomenon where sometimes words are written in the Torah in a way that we don't pronounce it, right? It's written as if it was singular, but it's pronounced as if it was plural. So it's just because it's a figure of speech.
We say them in English, it's a figure of speech, and we all know what it means, but
yeah. So the thing that maybe occurred to me just now, maybe it's not a great example, but there's certain words in English that like, what's the plural of fish?
Sometimes fish.
Fish. I don't say fishes. So it could be that maybe in Semitic language there's something similar that Yud Daled Vav, his hand, it also could mean his hands, like they were interchangeable. So it's possible. It's just important to note that Rabbeinu Bachya thinks he answered your question. He's a Kabbalist. He says that Yud Daled Vav is there as the printed version because it's actually alluding to a Kabbalistic notion of the superiority of one hand, meaning the right hand, which then becomes expressed that the Kohen is supposed to have the right hand slightly higher than the left hand when he does the Birkat Kohanim. So Rabbeinu Bachya did address your question, but in a very different way, saying that there's some kind of mystical significance the way it's written, but in a halachic sense or a normative sense, it's yadav, both hands. Okay, now I want to take a look at another Gemara to develop the theme that we're working on right now. A lot of people don't know this, but there's a tefillah that the Kohanim say, and I don't know if you say this, Bruce. Maybe I shouldn't put you on the spot here, but the Gemara says the following. When he turns his face away from the congregation, he's already done the blessing. What does the Kohen say? Master of the universe, we have performed that which you decreed upon us. Do unto us as you have promised us, namely, so shall they put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. That's actually from the text of the Birkat Kohanim in the book of Bamidbar. We'll get to that in just a minute. Look forth from your holy habitation, from heaven, and bless your people, Israel. So I just want to think about this little prayer that the Kohanim say for a moment. They're saying, look, we did what you told us to do, right? And it uses this word gzeirah. we did mashe gazarta aleinu. We did what you had decreed upon us. Now you, God, do your part, which is to give the blessing, right? And I will bless them. That's the verse in Numbers chapter 6, verse 27. I, God, meaning, as God, you said in Devarim, look forth from your holy habitation from heaven and bless your people. Blessing comes from God. So the Maharsha sharpens this. Often the term gzeirah, you, God, decreed upon us to do something. We followed your decree. Often the word gzeirah means something arbitrary, like something that can't be explained in the way you might have necessarily wanted to explain it in a very rational way. It's just a gzeirah. We just did it. Something we had to do. It's not what you think it is. Now, God, we did what you told us to do. We didn't ask questions. Now you do your part, which should actually issue forth the blessing. Look what the Maharsha says. So he says, since the blessing is dependent on God, as it is written in Parshat Naso, when it actually talks about the priestly blessing, I will bless them, I, God. And if so, why is the blessing of the Kohanim required? It's nothing other than a decree of the king upon them. It's really not required. God issues the blessing, not the Kohanim. But for some reason, God wanted the Kohanim to do this rigmarole. Right? God wanted it that way. It is nothing other than a decree of the king upon them. They should bless Israel, and he desires their blessing, as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says. Now, what does Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? Take a look at this Gemara, Masechet Sotah. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, from where is it derived that the whole blessed be he desires the priestly benediction? For some reason, God, in his inscrutable desires, wanted the Kohanim to do this funny stuff. As it is stated, so shall they put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. Let's just take a look at that pasuk in context, just to appreciate what's going on here. Here is, drum roll, Bרכת Kohanim, Parshat Naso. By the Hashem and Moshe Lemor, and Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, Daber Aaron, Vel Banav, speak to Aaron, to his children, and to Bruce. Lemor, Ko Tivarachut B'nai Israel. Thus shall you bless B'nai Israel. Amor lehem, say to them, Yivarech Hashem v'yishmerecha, Yair Hashem panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. That's the blessing. And now, the Torah says, and this is Hashem speaking, V'samu et shmi al B'nai Israel. They shall place my name upon B'nai Israel. Right? Bruce is going to do this rigmarole with his hands. Va'ani avarachem. I will bless them. So you see how there's a total continuity with this use of the hands, where our tradition emphatically emphasizes this is not magic. When Moshe's hands are raised in the war against Amalek, his hands aren't conducting warfare. It's so that people will look up to heaven. The hands have to be up towards heaven. The same thing we saw with the pole, with the copper serpent on it. It is not voodoo. It's not some kind of amulet. Rather, it's a symbolic way for eyes to turn towards heaven, to look for salvation. And so too with Aharon. Rabbeinu Bachya is so insistent that Vayisa Aaron et Yadav, that the hands are lifted up straight, not towards, but straight up, in order for us to understand that the blessing is Va'ani avarachem. I, Hashem, will bless them. The hands of the Kohanim are a gzeirah. The blessing is from Hashem. And therefore, Rabbeinu Bachya is so insistent that we're talking about both hands, not towards the people. It's not shooting voodoo rays upwards. salvation, blessing from one source only, not from a human being, not from the Pope in his Pope mobile as he goes through the crowds, dispensing these voodoo blessings with his hand as he waves it to and fro, his right hand, and saying that it's based upon our own. Bachya explodes with anger. This is paganism. That when we associate human beings with having powers to change the world through these mysterious mechanisms, and we don't realize that it's our Father in heaven that is a source of blessing, but some guy named Pope Seymour III, that already devolves into pagism.
Don't we have
Therefore,
the
just
idea of going to the football?
One second, Bruce. I just want to just make one more point. I mentioned earlier that this is sort of a pet peeve of mine. I hope I don't step on anybody's toes right now or their hands. One often sees approaches that confer upon human beings supernatural powers, or upon mitzvah objects like a mezuzah, supernatural powers. And we could give many, many examples of this. This is extremely dangerous. It's the road to pagan voodoo, in which there are human beings and there are forces in the world that certain human beings can control, or objects that have no moral significance, but just their mere presence can ward off forces of evil and attract forces of beneficence. Beta Bachya goes crazy about this, and for good reasons. Because this is the difference between monotheism in its pure form and the slippery slope to pagan idolatry. And superstition is the slippery slope which leads to this undermining of perhaps the most fundamental revolutionary idea of Judaism. There's only one sovereign. It's God. Not the Pope, and not your mezuzah, and not the Kohanim, with all due respect to our wonderful Kohanim who are now present. Bruce, you had a question, speaking of our wonderful Kohanim.
Yeah, do you think it's a recent phenomena where people go to a makubal for a bracha, or we have a recent death now of a well-known gadol in Torah? People might say with his passing, somehow some merit of brachot is lost in the world, as if their presence, just their presence, brought some schut to the generation. That type of idea that people are endowed with some special energy.
Yeah. So I'll say the following, and I haven't done sufficient research, so I'm just speculating right now. I have a feeling that there's been this kind of cross synthesis or cross pollination, maybe is a better word. Misnagdim have become Hasidim, and Hasidim have become Misnagdim. I mean, I really have to do a PhD thesis to try to prove this. But I think the notion, especially in the Litvish world, that you're going to go to these Gedolei Torah for a bracha. I mean, I may be wrong, but I have a feeling that 200 years ago, this wasn't done. And in the opposite, the fact that the Hasidic world has become much more tame and much more emphasis on learning Torah and on following the Shulchan Aruch is a kind of cross-pollination in the other direction. So I do think there's a lot. Yeah,
there are many cases where we find they went to Hebron. Meraglim went to Hebron. Yirmiyahu goes to Kever.
Yeah. So that's no. So this is actually the next point I wanted to make, and that is there is a ton of material. Take mezuzah, for instance. The Gemara says that you're supposed to place the mezuzah towards the on the doorpost closer to the outside of the house so that it can protect. That's the words of the Gemara. So that lends itself to an interpretation that this is some kind of force field. You want more of the house to be encompassed within the force field by having the mezuzah closer to the external part of the house, exterior. So, and of course, we know what the Rambam says there. It's very famous. The Rambam says, yeah, it protects. It just doesn't protect the house. By looking at the content of the mezuzah as soon as you walk in, so it's closer, right? You see it right away. You're reminded of God, your obligations to God, to walk the straight and narrow, etc. There's no voodoo here. And he goes on a long tirade against interpreting it as some kind of voodoo special force field. Same thing, we have many, many traditions of going to Kivrei Tzadikim, the graves of the righteous, to pray. Now, what's going on there? So this becomes very subtle and dangerous. And if you take a look at all of the discussion of this idea, if you pray to the tzaddik that's buried there, this could be a biblical prohibition. There's a whole separate shiur. But if we say that by going to the grave of a tzaddik, it inspires us to pray with greater fervor by remembering who this individual was, their extraordinary personality and piety, etc., that's positive. Or we say to a Kadosh Baruch Hu, I may be kind of a rotten bum and not deserving of your chesed, but I'd like to kind of remind you that we've had many fine Jews, and maybe in their merit, like this guy in the ground here, maybe you could give us a break. So that's okay too, right? But you see the slippery slope. It becomes extremely easy to devolve from some notion of inspiration, inspired by the memory of this tzaddik, or asking God to think of these tzaddikim and to give us merit collectively on behalf of these tzaddikim, because of these tzaddikim. That's all fine. But I have a feeling that a lot of people going to these graves of the tzaddikim are praying to the tzaddikim. And that already borders on, if not, maybe not borders on. Speaking to the dead is a biblical prohibition. So I would just say that we could give many, many, many examples of customs, texts, which lend themselves to a voodoo, supernatural, pagan interpretation, in my eyes. And so we have to look at them very carefully. And the example of the mezuzah is a really good example, because the Rambam wrote extensively on this, and you can see how the Talmudic text could be interpreted or misinterpreted according to the Rambam, and the Rambam's insistence that it be interpreted in a way which avoids the idolatrous pagan notions that are involved in voodoo. So I'm saying I understand there are many, many customs and many sources that are ambiguous and lend themselves to be misinterpreted. And my personal peeve is, and you can disagree with me, it's a free country here in Gush Etzion. So we have to be very careful about these types of things. If you're someone who's into voodoo, whatever, not my style. But it's something that I think is extremely important point to be made. And this is a great example with Reinu Bachya. And why he gets so upset about the position of the hands, right? Is it hands plural? Are they raised upwards, right? Or is it just one hand waving towards the crowd? It seems like a small issue. Rabbeinu Bachya got very upset about it, precisely because of this issue of is God who has a monopoly on things, or there are human beings who somehow have these supernatural powers as well. So we'll leave it at that, and Bezrat Hashem, we will continue next week. And I've not forgotten about our shiur on Martians. So it's coming up. It's in preparation still. It'll be out of this world.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Zev. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
We have to raise 2 hands.